Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Abilene, Texas. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The winter of 1891 brought more than just cold winds to Abilene. In the last days of December, when most townsfolk were preparing for the new year, the discovery of a sealed jar behind the floorboards of the Drover's Rest Saloon set in motion an investigation that would uncover decades of whispered rumors, suspicious disappearances, and a horror that had been hiding in plain sight. Marshal Thomas Wilkins, who found the jar while inspecting the property after a small fire, initially thought nothing of the cloudy amber liquid inside. It wasn't until Dr. Joseph Eckhart examined the contents 3 days later that anyone realized what they were dealing with. The substance wasn't just whiskey. According to Eckhart's preliminary notes dated January 2, 1892, the liquid contained what appeared to be rendered human adipose tissue, human fat. The Abilene Daily Reflector, in its January 4th edition, reported only that unusual substances had been discovered at the Drover's Rest and that Marshal Wilkins was conducting a thorough investigation. The paper, conscious of its readership's sensibilities, avoided mentioning the true nature of the find. This discretion would not last long. By January 10th, rumors were circulating throughout the town, growing more elaborate with each telling. Some claimed that bodies had been found buried beneath the saloon floor. Others whispered that Thorne had been practicing dark arts in the cellar after hours. The truth, when it finally emerged, would prove more disturbing than these speculations. The story of the Drover's Rest Saloon begins not with this discovery, but nearly 20 years earlier, when Abilene was transforming from a cattle town into something resembling civilization. The railroad had brought prosperity, and with it, opportunity for men like Malcolm Thorne. Records from the Taylor County Clerk's office show that Thorne purchased the property at the corner of Pine and 3rd Street in March of 1873, using funds he claimed came from inheritance and years of work as a cattle broker in Kansas City. The red brick building he constructed stood 2 stories tall, with the saloon occupying the ground floor and rooms for rent above. By all accounts, it was an establishment of moderate reputation, neither the most respectable in town nor the most disreputable. Malcolm Thorne himself presented a similar contradiction. Town records describe him as a man of about 40 when he arrived, with a thick mustache that partially concealed a scar running from the right corner of his mouth toward his ear. He dressed well, but not ostentatiously. He spoke with what one newspaper account called the refined accent of an Eastern education, yet seemed perfectly at home among the rough cowboys and cattle drivers who frequented his establishment. The Abilene Gazette, in a feature on local businesses published in 1875, noted that Thorne was a bachelor of private habits who keeps mostly to himself when not attending to his thriving business. Few people claim to know him well. Before coming to Abilene, Thorne's history was largely a blank slate. He offered vague references to time spent in St. Louis, Kansas City, and points east, but provided few specifics that could be verified. A letter discovered during the later investigation from a business associate in Kansas City, dated 1872, referred to Thorne's unfortunate circumstances and necessary departure from that city, though without elaborating on what these might have entailed. The 1870 census records for Kansas City include a listing for a M. Thorne working as a clerk in a mercantile establishment, but whether this was the same individual remains uncertain. What is known with greater certainty is that Thorne arrived in Abilene with sufficient capital to establish himself immediately as a business owner rather than an employee. He paid cash for his property and for the construction of his building, unusual in a time when most developments involved loans or partnerships. He also arrived with a considerable collection of books, not just ledgers and business manuals, but volumes on chemistry, human anatomy, and historical accounts of various cultures' ritual practices. These books, later cataloged by investigators, suggested a man of unusual education and eclectic interests. The Drover's Rest quickly established itself as a reliable stopping point for men moving cattle north along the Chisholm Trail. The guest rooms upstairs weren't fancy, but they were clean, and the whiskey served downstairs was reportedly of better quality than most establishments offered. What set Thorne's place apart, however, was something that became known locally as the Special Reserve. Handwritten ledgers recovered from the saloon's office indicate that by 1827, Thorne had begun offering a premium whiskey to select customers. All was served in a distinctive blue glass bottle kept behind the bar. All was at a price significantly higher than his other spirits. Those who tried it described it as having an unusual richness, a distinctive mouth-feel that lingered. Word spread among certain circles, and men would specifically request Thorne's Special Reserve when passing through Abilene. In an 1878 letter to his brother in St. Louis, cattle buyer William Harrison wrote, "I've developed quite a taste for Thorne's particular brand. There's nothing like it anywhere else along the trail, and I find myself looking forward to reaching Abilene just to sample it again." Thorne claims it's his own recipe, though he guards the method jealously. The testimonies collected after the scandal broke revealed that the Special Reserve produced effects beyond those of ordinary whiskey. A statement from James Carver, a railroad executive who had sampled it during an 1882 visit to Abilene, described a warmth that spread through the body unlike regular spirits, followed by a clarity of thought rather than the usual dulling of the senses. Most curious was a feeling of vitality that lasted well into the following day. Others reported similar experiences, with several noting that the drink seemed to heighten certain appetites and reduce moral inhibitions, effects they attributed at the time to its alcoholic potency rather than its more sinister ingredients. Thorne managed the distribution of his Special Reserve carefully. The blue bottles never left the premises. Customers consumed the contents on site, paying premium prices for the privilege. According to bar ledgers, by 1880, a single glass cost the equivalent of a laborer's daily wage. Despite this, demand remained steady among a select clientele who could afford such an indulgence. Thorne maintained an air of exclusivity around the product, sometimes claiming that limited supply prevented him from serving it to all who asked. This only increased its allure among the wealthy and status-conscious. The period between 1878 and 1885 marks what might be called the golden years of the Drover's Rest. Business was steady, and Thorne became, if not beloved, then at least a respected fixture in the community. He contributed to local charity drives, attended the Methodist Church on occasion, and even served briefly on a committee to improve town sanitation. Yet he remained fundamentally unknown to his neighbors. As Barbara Wilson, whose family owned the general store across the street, later told investigators, "Mr. Thorne was always polite, always proper, but there was something in his eyes that never quite matched his smile. My father said he was a man with secrets, though we never imagined what kind." During these years, Thorne established a pattern that would continue throughout his time in Abilene. He would travel periodically, usually claiming business interests in Fort Worth, Dallas, or other regional centers. These trips typically lasted a week to 10 days and occurred approximately every 2 months. Later investigation revealed that at least some of these journeys were genuine. Thorne maintained accounts at banks in several cities and conducted legitimate business with liquor distributors and other suppliers. However, discrepancies in the timing of certain transactions suggested that not all of his reported destinations matched his actual whereabouts. Of particular interest was a property Thorne purchased in 1879, located some 30 miles outside Abilene in a sparsely populated area of Taylor County. County records describe it as 160 acres with small dwelling, purchased from a farmer named Henry Gladwell, who had reportedly decided to return east after several difficult seasons. Thorne never mentioned this property to his acquaintances in Abilene, and it does not appear in any of his business records associated with the saloon. When questioned during the investigation, Neighbors in the vicinity of the property recalled seeing Thorne there occasionally, always alone, though smoke from the chimney was observed more frequently than his visible presence would account for. The first disappearance associated with the Drover's Rest occurred in September 1880. A cattle driver named Eli Jackson was last seen leaving the saloon late one evening. His companions reported that he'd mentioned feeling unwell after drinking heavily and had decided to step outside for air. He never returned to his room upstairs. Initially, no one thought much of it. Men frequently drifted in and out of Abilene with the cattle herds, but Jackson had left his belongings, including a pocket watch he was known to value highly, in his room. Marshal James Cooper, who served as town law enforcement at the time, conducted what newspaper accounts describe as a cursory investigation. Cooper's report, preserved in county records, notes that Thorne claimed Jackson had appeared ill that evening and had been drinking heavily. "It's not uncommon for men to wander off and find themselves in the creek," Cooper wrote, referring to Elm Creek, which runs through Abilene. "With the water high from recent rains, it's likely his body was carried downstream." The case was closed within a week, and Jackson joined the anonymous ranks of men who disappeared along the cattle trails. What Cooper's report failed to mention, but later came to light through testimony from a former deputy, was that Marshal Cooper was among the select customers who regularly enjoyed Thorne's special reserve, often consuming it free of charge. Whether this connection influenced the limited scope of his investigation remains a matter of speculation, but the pattern of minimal official response would repeat itself in subsequent cases. Between 1880 and 1885, records indicate at least 7 men vanished after being seen at or near the Drover's Rest. In each case, circumstances allowed for plausible explanations: gambling debts that might have prompted a hasty departure, threats of violence from rivals, or simply the transient nature of the cattle trade itself. What no one connected at the time was that each man had been seen drinking with Thorne himself before disappearing. This detail emerged only decades later, when Lucinda Moore, who had worked as a barmaid at the Drover's Rest, gave her account to authorities in 1929, shortly before her death. "Mr. Thorne had a way about him," Moore's statement reads. "He could spot them, men who wouldn't be missed. Usually they were strangers passing through, without companions or with only casual acquaintances. He'd offer them a special drink on the house. Said it was a tradition for first-time visitors. I noticed that those who accepted often looked unsteady afterward, more than the liquor would account for. Sometimes Mr. Thorne would help them upstairs to a room. By morning, they'd be gone, and he'd say they'd left at first light." Moore's testimony included specific recollections of several men, though she admitted that after so many years, the faces and names had begun to blur together. One case she remembered clearly involved a young man she called the Poet, a scholarly-looking individual who had arrived in Abilene in the spring of 1883, apparently traveling west for his health. He carried a book of verse with him and would recite poems when encouraged by the other patrons. Mr. Thorne took a particular interest in him, claiming to be a lover of literature himself. They spent an evening in deep conversation with Mr. Thorne, serving him from the blue bottle repeatedly. The next day, when I asked after him, Mr. Thorne said he'd decided to continue to San Antonio immediately, but his valise remained in his room for nearly a week before Mr. Thorne finally removed it. Particularly disturbing was Moore's recollection of Thorne's demeanor following these disappearances. "He was always at his most pleasant the day after someone had gone missing," she stated. "He would be generous with the regular customers, offering free drinks and engaging in conversation more than was his usual habit, and for a few days afterward, he would spend long hours in the small building behind the saloon, what he called his smokehouse. The smell that came from it was peculiar, not like regular smoking meat at all, but something sweeter and more cloying." The year 1885 marked a turning point for both Abilene and Malcolm Thorne. The great cattle drives were dwindling as railroads expanded and transformed the industry. Abilene was becoming less a waypoint and more a settled community. For the Drover's Rest, This meant fewer transient customers and more regular local patrons, men who would be missed if they disappeared. Perhaps coincidentally, perhaps not, the pattern of disappearances changed. Instead of men vanishing from Abilene itself, reports began to emerge from surrounding communities and farms of travelers who were never seen again after saying they were heading to town. During this period, Thorne began to make changes to the saloon's physical structure. County building permits show he added a substantial cellar in 1886, ostensibly for storing liquor and supplies. He also constructed a small outbuilding behind the main structure, which he referred to as his smokehouse, claiming to locals that he was experimenting with creating his own meat products as a side business. Few people ever entered this building, according to later testimony, though smoke was often seen rising from its chimney, particularly at night. The construction of the cellar was supervised by a contractor from Dallas rather than a local builder, unusual for the time, and suggesting Thorne wanted features that he preferred not to explain to his neighbors. The completed space was significantly larger than would be needed for storing liquor alone, and included unusual features such as floor drains, specialized ventilation, and walls lined with glazed tile that would allow for easy cleaning. The contractor interviewed during the investigation recalled that Thorne had explained these features as necessary for maintaining proper temperature and humidity for his valuable spirits, as well as protecting against possible flooding from Elm Creek during heavy rains. The most significant development during this middle period of the Drover's Rest history was Thorne's increasing relationship with Dr. Calvin Reed, who arrived in Abilene in 1887 to establish a medical practice. Reed was younger than Thorne by at least 15 years, described in contemporary accounts as thin and scholarly, with spectacles and carefully combed dark hair. Unlike Thorne, Reed was gregarious, quickly establishing himself in local society and even courting the daughter of a prominent rancher for a time, though the relationship eventually ended. Reed became a regular at the Drover's Rest, often seen in deep conversation with Thorne in a corner booth. Several witnesses later recalled that the two men frequently exchanged books and papers and were overheard discussing topics ranging from chemistry to anatomy. Most dismissed this as the natural intellectual curiosity of educated men in a frontier town with limited cultural resources. A notation in the personal diary of Reverend George Simmons, dated April 1888, offers a different perspective. Had dinner with Dr. Reed today, bright young man but troubled in spirit, I think. When I mentioned Thorne's name, a strange expression crossed his face. He quickly changed the subject, but not before I glimpsed something like fear in his eyes. Reed's practice thrived in Abilene, due in part to his modern education and in part to his personable manner. He introduced new treatments and surgical techniques previously unavailable in the region, earning the gratitude of many patients and their families. His standing in the community made him an unlikely associate for the more reclusive Thorne, yet their connection deepened over time. By 1889, Reed was making regular visits to the Drover's Rest after his office hours, and the two men were occasionally seen riding together toward Thorne's rural property. What exactly transpired during these excursions remains largely conjecture, but certain facts established during the investigation suggest disturbing possibilities. Invoices found among Reed's papers showed purchases of unusual chemicals and specialized medical equipment, often in quantities greater than his practice would require. Particularly notable were orders for various preservatives, surgical instruments designed for precise tissue removal, and distillation apparatus not typically used in medical treatment. These items were delivered not to Reed's office, but to a post office box, maintained under a different name. By 1890, the character of the Drover's Rest had changed considerably. While still operating as a saloon, Thorne had expanded into what he called private events, gatherings held in a back room for select guests, mostly successful businessmen and ranchers from Abilene and surrounding communities. These events occurred roughly once a month, always on a Saturday night, and always by invitation only. Thorne employed a heavy-set man known only as Pritchard to stand guard at the door during these gatherings, turning away any uninvited patrons who attempted to enter. What transpired at these events remained largely unknown until the investigations of 1892, but rumors circulated. Some said it was merely a high-stakes poker game. Others whispered about women brought in from Dallas or Fort Worth. The truth, as it emerged later, was far more disturbing. These gatherings centered around Thorne's Special Reserve whiskey, which by this time had acquired almost mythical status among a certain circle. Men would travel considerable distances to sample it, paying exorbitant prices for the privilege. The ledger recovered from Thorne's office listed payments of up to $50 for a single glass, an astronomical sum for the time. According to testimony from those who had attended these events, and who later claimed ignorance of the true nature of what they were consuming, the evenings followed a ritual-like progression. Guests would arrive at the appointed hour and be escorted to the back room, which was furnished with comfortable chairs, low tables, and subdued lighting from oil lamps with red-glass chimneys. Thorne would welcome each man personally, engaging in small talk until all invited had arrived. Then, with a certain ceremony, he would present the blue glass bottles, each labeled with what he claimed were dates and vintage designations. He spoke about each bottle as though describing fine wine, recalled James Harrington, a banker who attended several gatherings in 1890. He would mention the notes and character one might detect, the finish and body of each variety. It seemed pretentious, even comical, given that we were discussing whiskey rather than French wine, but the prices commanded a certain respect for the ritual. Harrington, like most who testified, insisted that he had believed the Special Reserve to be merely an unusually crafted spirit, perhaps enhanced with rare herbs or unique aging processes. The evening would proceed with each guest receiving measured portions from different bottles, with Thorne providing elaborate commentary on the qualities of each. As the night progressed, the atmosphere reportedly became increasingly uninhibited, with conversations turning to subjects that would have been considered inappropriate in regular society. Several attendees admitted to experiencing unusual effects beyond normal intoxication, heightened sensory perception, increased physical energy, and what one described as appetites that seemed to come from some deeper, more primitive part of the self. Dr. Reed would often attend these gatherings, though witnesses noted that he rarely partook of the Special Reserve himself, claiming that his medical duties required him to maintain his faculties. Instead, he would observe the others, occasionally making notes in a small book he carried. Later investigation would reveal that these notes documented the effects of different formulations on the consumers, tracking physical and psychological responses with clinical detachment. The final chapter of the Drover's Rest began on December 27, 1891, with the small fire that led to Marshall Wilkins's discovery of the hidden jar. The fire itself started in the kitchen and was quickly contained, causing minimal damage. Had Wilkins been less thorough in his inspection, or had the floorboard not been slightly warped from the water used to douse the flames, revealing the space beneath, the jar might never have been found. And had Dr. Eckhart not recently read a medical journal article about the properties of human tissue, he might never have recognized the true nature of the contents. Eckhart's discovery put him in a difficult position. As a medical professional relatively new to Abilene, he was concerned about making accusations against established community members without absolute certainty. He conducted additional tests over the next 2 days, consulting medical texts and even corresponding by telegraph with a former colleague in St. Louis who had expertise in forensic analysis. Only when he was convinced beyond doubt did he approach Marshall Wilkins with his findings. Wilkins himself faced a similar dilemma. The implications of Eckhart's analysis were so disturbing, so far beyond the usual crimes he dealt with, that his first instinct was to seek confirmation before taking official action. However, recognizing the potential severity of the situation, he decided to proceed cautiously but quickly. On January 2nd, he sent a telegraph to the Texas Rangers requesting assistance, phrasing his message in deliberately vague terms to avoid causing panic should it be intercepted or gossiped about by telegraph operators. Once the initial discovery was made, events moved rapidly. Marshal Wilkins, accompanied by 3 deputies, returned to the Drover's Rest on January 3, 1892, with a warrant to search the premises thoroughly. Thorne was not present, having departed suddenly the previous day, telling his staff he needed to visit a supplier in Fort Worth. This absence immediately raised suspicions, though no one yet knew that Thorne would never return to Abilene. The search began in the main saloon and worked methodically through the building. In Thorne's private office, behind a false panel in a bookcase, investigators discovered a journal bound in dark leather. The contents of this journal, written in Thorne's meticulous hand, detailed a horror that had been unfolding for nearly 2 decades. The journal began in 1873, shortly after Thorne's arrival in Abilene, and continued until December 1891. The earliest entries were primarily business records interspersed with personal observations, but by 1879 they had taken a disturbing turn. An entry dated August 14, 1879 reads, "Experiment 12 shows promise. The rendering process must be slow, at low heat, to preserve the essential qualities. Too high a temperature destroys the effect entirely." Mixed at a ratio of 1.3 with the Kentucky bourbon, the result is remarkable. The flavor is indescribable, but the effect on the mind is what interests me most. A sense of warmth and power unlike anything from alcohol alone. There is something primal in it, as though one is consuming the very essence of another's life force. The journal went on to detail Thorne's methodology with clinical precision. He had developed a system for selecting victims. All was men who were physically healthy but socially isolated, preferably strangers passing through town. He would dose their regular drinks with a compound he referred to as the sedative, a mixture that Dr. Reed later helped him refine. Once the victim was incapacitated, Thorne would help them to a room upstairs, ostensibly to sleep off the effects. Instead, the journal described how he would administer a lethal dose of the same compound, then begin the process of harvesting. The most disturbing aspects of the journal concerned what Thorne called his refinement of the process. Early entries described crude methods and disappointing results, but over time, and especially after Dr. Reed's arrival in Abilene, the technique became more sophisticated. Thorne detailed how certain parts of the body yielded fat with different properties, and how the diet and health of the victim affected the final product. He was creating, in essence, a connoisseur's guide to his horrific practice. Thorne's writings revealed a mind that combined methodical scientific observation with disturbing philosophical musings. Between detailed notes on temperatures, times, and chemical reactions were passages that attempted to justify his actions through references to ancient practices and obscure historical texts. He frequently cited customs of various indigenous cultures, often misinterpreted or entirely fabricated, that he claimed involved ritual consumption of enemies to absorb their strength. These references appeared to be drawn from the anthropological and historical volumes found in his collection, though twisted to support his own aberrant beliefs. Particularly chilling was Thorne's categorization of his victims and the resulting products. He developed a complex system of notation classifying each batch according to the physical characteristics and personal qualities of the source. Men who displayed particular strength, intelligence, or other traits Thorne admired were processed separately, their rendered fat reserved for his most expensive offerings. In later entries, he speculated about whether specific emotional states at the time of death might affect the properties of the final product, leading to experiments that the investigating officers found too disturbing to include in their official reports. The search continued into the cellar that Thorne had added in 1886. Behind a wall of wine barrels, investigators discovered a hidden door leading to a chamber that did not appear on any building plans. Marshall Wilkins' official report describes it as a room approximately 12 feet square with a stone floor sloping to a central drain. The walls were lined with shelves containing glass containers of various sizes, each meticulously labeled with dates and notations. A large copper vessel, similar to those used in distilleries but modified with additional fixtures, dominated one corner. The room was immaculately clean, with no visible stains despite its apparent purpose. The glass containers held liquids in various stages of processing, from cloudy yellowish substances in larger vessels to clear amber fluid in smaller bottles ready for mixing with whiskey. Laboratory analysis later confirmed that all contained rendered human fat in different states of refinement. The copper vessel, upon closer examination, proved to be a specialized apparatus for the slow, controlled rendering process Thorne had described in his journal, with modifications that allowed for precise temperature regulation and filtration of the resulting product. Perhaps most disturbing to the investigators was the evidence of how long this operation had been functioning undiscovered. Dates on the containers went back years, and the sophisticated setup suggested gradual development and refinement over time. This was not the work of a madman in the grip of sudden frenzy, but of a methodical individual who had patiently built his horrific enterprise while maintaining a respectable facade. The final location searched was the outbuilding Thorne had claimed was his smokehouse. Here, investigators found what Marshall Wilkins described as a chamber of horrors disguised as a workshop. Tools of various kinds hung from the walls, many clearly medical in nature, and later determined to have been supplied by Dr. Reed. A large oven, more sophisticated than would be needed for smoking meat, occupied much of the space. Most damning was the discovery of human remains, primarily bones that had been broken down and apparently prepared for disposal, hidden beneath the floorboards. Analysis of these remains proved challenging due to the condition in which they were found. Thorne had apparently developed methods for breaking down the bones and treating them with chemicals that accelerated decomposition, likely to facilitate disposal without raising suspicion. Dr. Eckhart, assisted by a forensic specialist who arrived with the Texas Rangers on January 7th, was able to determine that the remains represented at least 4 individuals, though the actual number may have been higher. The specialist's report noted that the methodical processing of the remains suggests not just practical concerns about disposal, but possibly a ritual aspect to the handling of the bodies after the valuable fat had been extracted. As the investigation expanded, authorities began to piece together the full extent of Thorne's activities. The blue glass bottles behind the bar contained not just whiskey, but whiskey mixed with rendered human fat in varying proportions. The private events held in the back room were tastings, where wealthy patrons sampled different vintages of Thorne's Special Reserve, unaware of its true composition. According to ledgers found in the office, some bottles had sold for as much as $500, purchased by collectors who believed they were acquiring a uniquely crafted spirit. The role of Dr. Calvin Reed became a central question. He had vanished from Abilene on the same day as Thorne, suggesting complicity. But the nature and extent of his involvement remained unclear until his capture in Denver 3 months later. Reed initially claimed ignorance of Thorne's activities, insisting he had provided medical advice and compounds in good faith, believing they were for legitimate experiments in distilling. This defense crumbled when investigators discovered letters between the two men that clearly indicated Reed's knowledge. In a statement given after his arrest, Reed claimed that his involvement began innocently enough. Thorne approached me shortly after my arrival in Abilene, expressing interest in my medical knowledge. He presented himself as an amateur scientist, fascinated by chemistry and its applications to his business. At first, our discussions were entirely theoretical, the effects of various compounds on flavor profiles, preservation techniques, the chemical composition of spirits. It was intellectually stimulating, a welcome change from the routine medical concerns of a small town. Reed went on to describe how Thorne gradually revealed more of his true interests, first presenting his theories about human fat as a theoretical discussion, then eventually admitting to having already conducted experiments. By that point, Reed claimed, he was too deeply involved to extricate himself. Thorne made it clear that any attempt to expose him would implicate me as well. He had carefully ensured that my handwriting appeared on certain documents, that my name was associated with orders for particular chemicals, and there was the financial aspect. He paid generously for my expertise, funds that allowed me to establish my practice and position in society. The most disturbing element of Reed's testimony concerned the effects of Thorne's special reserve. According to Reed, the combination of alcohol and human fat, prepared through Thorne's specialized process, produced a substance with unusual psychoactive properties. Those who consumed it reported not just intoxication, but a sense of heightened vitality, mental clarity, and what some described as a feeling of dominance or power. Thorne theorized that something essential in human fat, what he called life essence, was being transferred to the drinker. It was nonsense from a scientific perspective, of course, but he believed it fervently. Reed's capture came about through a stroke of luck rather than skilled detective work. A former patient from Abilene visiting relatives in Denver recognized him on the street despite his attempt to alter his appearance with a beard and different style of dress. The patient notified local authorities, who arrested Reed without incident at a boarding house where he had been living under the name Charles Wilson. Among his possessions, they found notes for what appeared to be a book on alternative medical preparations of the American frontier, possibly an attempt to profit from his knowledge while disguising its true source. This aspect of the case particularly captured public imagination when the story broke in newspapers across the country in April 1892. The idea that prominent citizens had knowingly or unknowingly participated in a form of cannibalism sent shockwaves through Abilene society. Several men who had attended Thorne's private events left town permanently, despite no evidence that they had known the true nature of what they were consuming. Others faced social ostracism, their businesses ruined by association. The San Antonio Express, in a front-page article on April 10, 1892, captured the national sentiment. The horrors revealed in the heretofore quiet town of Abilene surpass the wildest imaginings of penny dreadful authors. That such depravity could exist beneath a veneer of respectability in a community where neighbors know one another by name challenges our most fundamental assumptions about civilization's triumph over mankind's baser nature. The human cost of Thorne's activities proved difficult to quantify precisely. Based on his journal entries and financial records, investigators estimated that between 1879 and 1891 he was responsible for the deaths of at least 23 individuals. The true number may have been higher, as the journal sometimes referenced unsuccessful specimens, without providing details that would allow for identification. Most victims remained anonymous, their disappearances never connected to Abilene or the Drover's Rest. Among the few victims who could be identified with certainty was Thomas Blackwood, a geologist who had come to Texas in 1888 to conduct surveys for a mining company. Blackwood's employers had reported him missing after he failed to return from a trip to the Abilene area and had even hired a Pinkerton detective to investigate his disappearance. The detective's report, which concluded that Blackwood had likely abandoned his position to seek fortune in California, was contradicted by entries in Thorne's journal that described him as Specimen 17, noting his exceptional physical condition and particularly fine quality of rendered material. The investigation also uncovered evidence of Thorne's methods for disposing of remains that could not be utilized in his process. His remote property outside Abilene appeared to have served primarily for this purpose. Excavations there revealed multiple sites where bones and other remains had been buried, treated with quicklime to accelerate decomposition. A well on the property had been repurposed as a disposal site, its water deliberately contaminated to discourage any future use that might lead to discovery. Even with these findings, investigators believed that many bodies might never be located, particularly those from the earlier years before Thorne acquired the rural property. Malcolm Thorne himself was never brought to justice. Despite an extensive manhunt that extended across multiple states and into Mexico, he simply vanished. The last confirmed sighting occurred in Fort Worth on January 2, 1892, where he boarded a train heading south. Some speculated that he had accumulated enough wealth to establish a new identity elsewhere, perhaps even abroad. Others, noting his age and the stress of flight, suggested he might have died anonymously on the road. Tantalizing clues to his fate emerged periodically in the years following his disappearance. In 1895, a man matching Thorne's description was reported working as a pharmacist in New Orleans, but authorities arrived to find the establishment closed and the individual gone. In 1899, a former Abilene resident claimed to have seen Thorne in Mexico City operating a small cantina catering to American expatriates. Most intriguing was a report from 1904, when custom officials in Galveston intercepted a shipment of unusual glassware addressed to a merchant in British Honduras. The blue glass bottles inside were reportedly identical to those used at the Drover's Rest, though no connection to Thorne could be definitively established. Dr. Calvin Reed faced trial in July 1892 on charges of being an accessory to murder and grave desecration. Despite his attempts to portray himself as an unwilling participant acted under duress, the evidence of his willing collaboration was substantial. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment at Huntsville State Penitentiary, where he died of tuberculosis in 1897, having served less than 5 years of his sentence. During his incarceration, Reed began writing what he described as a full and factual account of the Thorne affair, supposedly to set the record straight about his own involvement. Prison authorities confiscated the manuscript before its completion, concerned that it contained inappropriate material that glorified the criminal acts rather than expressing proper remorse. The partial manuscript, preserved in state archives, reveals Reed's continuing fascination with the effects of Thorne's concoction, suggesting that his claimed reluctance to participate may have been less genuine than he maintained at trial. The aftermath of the case brought changes to Abilene. The Drover's Rest was demolished by order of the town council in March 1892. The lot left vacant for several years before eventually being developed into a hardware store. Many who had known Thorne or patronized his establishment found themselves subject to suspicion and rumor, their reputations tarnished by association. Some families chose to leave Abilene entirely, seeking places where the story was less well known. The demolition itself became a kind of public exorcism for the town. According to newspaper accounts, nearly 200 people gathered to watch as workers dismantled the building. The Abilene Daily Reflector reported that a palpable sense of relief spread through the assembled crowd as the walls came down, as though a shadow had been lifted from our community. Particular attention was paid to the complete destruction of the cellar and outbuilding, with the rubble hauled away and disposed of rather than being repurposed, as would normally have been the practice. More subtle but equally significant were the changes to local governance that followed. Marshal Wilkins instituted more rigorous procedures for investigating missing persons cases, refusing to dismiss disappearances as merely the natural mobility of frontier society. The town council established stricter licensing requirements for businesses, including provisions for regular inspections of premises serving food or drink. These measures were clearly responses to the failures that had allowed Thorne's activities to continue undetected for so long. The case also led to increased scrutiny of newcomers to the community, particularly those with undefined backgrounds or independent wealth. This wariness toward outsiders, while understandable in the aftermath of the Thorne revelations, had unfortunate consequences for Abilene's development. Several legitimate businesses opted to establish themselves in neighboring communities rather than face the suspicious environment in Abilene itself. The town's growth notably slowed in the years following 1892, though whether this was directly attributable to the Thorne case or to broader economic factors remains a matter of debate among historians. Perhaps the most lasting effect was on the collective psyche of the community. Abilene had experienced its share of frontier violence, shootings, brawls, the occasional robbery, but these were straightforward crimes committed in the heat of passion or for obvious gain. Thorne's methodical, years-long predation represented something fundamentally different and more disturbing. It suggested that horror could hide behind a respectable facade, that evil could operate patiently and systematically while being overlooked or ignored. This realization manifested in various ways. Local churches reported increased attendance in the months following the revelations, as residents sought spiritual reassurance and moral clarity. Social gatherings became more restricted, with families less willing to welcome comparative strangers into their homes. Most notably, consumption of alcohol declined significantly, with several saloons closing due to lack of business. The notion that one might unwittingly consume something harmful or forbidden had struck a profound chord of fear in the community. The blue glass bottles from behind the bar at the Drover's Rest became macabre collector's items, despite efforts by authorities to destroy all physical evidence associated with the case. Reports emerged periodically over the following decades of bottles appearing at private auctions or in the collections of those fascinated by the darker aspects of American history. Whether any still contained Thorne's original mixture is unknown, though most experts consider it unlikely given the perishable nature of the contents. In 1903, a particularly significant discovery related to these artifacts occurred during renovations to a building adjacent to the former site of the Drover's Rest. Workers uncovered a small cache of blue bottles that had apparently been concealed within a wall cavity. Analysis performed at the recently established laboratory at the University of Texas determined that residue in the bottles contained organic compounds consistent with the reported composition of Thorne's special reserve. This finding represented the first scientific confirmation of the mixture's nature beyond the original investigation's conclusions. The men who had attended Thorne's private tastings faced varying fates. Those who left Abilene immediately after the scandal broke generally fared better, establishing themselves in new communities where their past associations remained unknown. Those who stayed encountered persistent suspicion, regardless of their protestations of ignorance regarding what they had consumed. Several prominent businessmen saw their enterprises fail as customers and associates distance themselves. At least 2 committed suicide in the years following, though whether this was directly related to the scandal or to financial ruin resulting from it cannot be determined with certainty. James Harrington, the banker whose testimony about the tastings proved particularly valuable to investigators, suffered perhaps the most dramatic fall from social position. Once respected as a pillar of the community, he found himself ostracized even after cooperating fully with authorities. His bank faced a run as depositors withdrew their funds, unwilling to trust their money to a man who had participated in Thorne's gatherings. By 1894, Harrington had been forced to sell his home and relocate to his sister's residence in Oklahoma Territory, where he reportedly lived out his remaining years in relative seclusion. In 1929, interest in the case briefly resurged when Lucinda Moore, the former barmaid, gave her statement to authorities. Moore, by then elderly and in poor health, claimed to have additional information that had not been part of the original investigation. According to Moore, Thorne had confided in her that his interest in his particular form of whiskey had origins much earlier than his time in Abilene. He had allegedly told her of experiences during the Civil War, when extreme deprivation had led to desperate measures among some isolated units. He said once a man crossed that line, ordinary food and drink never satisfied again, Moore's statement read. He'd been searching for that same feeling ever since. Moore's testimony included previously undisclosed details about Thorne's background. She claimed he had told her he was originally from Virginia, from a family of some standing that had lost everything in the war. He had served in the Confederate Army, though in what capacity she was unsure, and had been part of a unit cut off behind Union lines for an extended period. It was during this desperate time, according to Moore's recollection of Thorne's account, that he had first encountered the practice that would later become his obsession. He spoke of it rarely, and only when deep in his cups, Moore stated, but on those occasions his eyes would take on a strange light. He told me of men who had been abandoned on the battlefield, of surgeons who had learned techniques from tribes in the Western Territories, of officers who justified terrible things in the name of survival. I cannot say how much was truth and how much his own dark fantasy, but he believed it. That much I am certain of. Moore also claimed that Thorne had not worked alone, even before Dr. Reed's involvement. She described a man she knew only as the Professor, who visited the Drover's Rest several times between 1877 and 1880, always meeting privately with Thorne. According to Moore, this individual provided Thorne with books and documents, as well as certain chemicals used in his process. Authorities investigated this claim but were unable to identify the individual in question or verify his existence. The description Moore provided was frustratingly vague. An older man, well-dressed but somewhat disheveled, with a distinctive limp, and what she called the accent of a European education. She recalled that Thorne had treated this visitor with unusual deference, almost as though he were in the presence of a mentor or superior. After these meetings, Thorne would often make changes to his procedures or introduce new elements to his special reserve, suggesting that the professor was providing guidance for his experiments. Researchers attempting to identify this mysterious figure have proposed various candidates, from legitimate chemists known to have traveled through Texas during the period to European immigrants with dubious pasts. One particularly intriguing theory, advanced in a 1958 monograph on the case, suggests a connection to a German physician who had been dismissed from a university position for unspecified ethical violations and was known to have emigrated to America in the 1870s. However, no definitive evidence has ever emerged to confirm the identity of the professor, or even to establish with certainty that he existed outside Moore's recollection. The final documented chapter in the story of Malcolm Thorne and the Drover's Rest came in 1952, when a history professor from Texas Tech University named Robert Garrison began researching the case for a book on infamous crimes of the American West. While examining county records in Taylor County, Garrison discovered a sealed envelope that had been misfiled among deed registrations. The envelope, marked with Thorne's name and the date January 1st, 1892, contained what appeared to be a letter never sent. The letter, addressed simply to those who seek understanding, read in part, "By the time this is discovered, I will be beyond your reach, either in this world or the next. I do not write to justify my actions or to seek forgiveness, but merely to correct certain misconceptions that will inevitably arise. What I created was not merely a beverage or an intoxicant, but a key to something primordial in human experience. Those who partook, especially those who returned again and again, understood this on some level, though they might not have acknowledged it consciously. There is a hunger in men that goes beyond food or drink, beyond physical pleasure or power. It is the hunger to consume and be consumed, to incorporate the essence of another into oneself. I did not create this hunger, I merely found a way to satisfy it." The letter continued for several pages, becoming increasingly philosophical and abstract in its ruminations. Garrison included excerpts in his book published in 1954, but noted that much of it was the rambling justifications of a disturbed mind. The original document was later transferred to the Texas State Archives in Austin, where it remains to this day, a disturbing artifact of one of the state's most unusual criminal cases. What struck many readers of Garrison's book was the lucidity of Thorne's writing even as the content revealed profound psychological disturbance. There was no hint of remorse, no acknowledgment of wrongdoing, but rather a tone that suggested he viewed himself as a pioneer or discoverer rather than a criminal. He repeatedly referenced historical practices of various cultures, though scholars later determined that many of his claims were either fabricated or based on misinterpretations of anthropological accounts popular in the late 19th century. Particularly disturbing was Thorne's discussion of his customers, whom he described as unwitting initiates into ancient mysteries. He expressed a kind of contempt for those who consumed his special reserve without questioning its true nature, while simultaneously claiming that on some unconscious level they knew and were drawn to it precisely because of what it represented. The civilized mind recoils, he wrote, but something older than civilization recognizes and yearns. It is this yearning that brought them back time and again, paying ever-increasing sums for what they could not admit they truly desired. The site where the Drovers' Rest once stood has seen multiple businesses come and go over the decades. Currently, it houses a small office building, unremarkable in appearance and unknown to most who pass by as having any historical significance. No plaque or marker indicates what once occurred there, the city of Abilene having long ago decided that some aspects of its past are better left uncommemorated. Yet the story persists in local lore, passed down through generations, occasionally revived by articles, books, or documentaries that explore the darker corners of Western history. For some, it represents merely a lurid tale from a rougher era, when law enforcement was limited and evil could operate with relative impunity. For others, it serves as a reminder that the most disturbing monsters are not supernatural creatures, but human beings whose appetites and actions cross boundaries most cannot even imagine. In the decades since the case was closed, various researchers and writers have attempted to track Thorne's life before Abilene, seeking clues to what might have shaped him into the person he became. Records suggest he may have used other names in other places, possibly operating similar establishments in Kansas and Missouri before arriving in Texas. Some accounts place him in New Orleans in the early 1870s, learning distilling techniques from practitioners there. A promising lead emerged in 1967 when historian Margaret Wilson, researching post-Civil War migration patterns, discovered military records for a Confederate soldier named Marcus Thornton, who matched several details of Thorne's known biography. This Thornton had served in a Virginia regiment that had indeed been cut off behind enemy lines for an extended period in 1864, lending credence to the account Thorne had supposedly shared with Lucinda Moore. After the war, Thornton had been briefly employed at a hospital in Richmond before disappearing from official records. The gap between this disappearance and Thorne's appearance in Kansas City is consistent with the timeline of his known activities. Further supporting this potential identification was a photograph Wilson discovered in a collection of Civil War memorabilia showing members of Thornton's regiment. Though the image quality was poor by modern standards, one figure bore a striking resemblance to the only known photograph of Malcolm Thorne, which had appeared in newspapers during the 1892 manhunt. Most notably, the soldier in the image had a visible facial scar similar to the one that witnesses had described on Thorne. The true origins of Malcolm Thorne, like his ultimate fate, remain shrouded in mystery. What is certain is that for almost 20 years he moved among the citizens of Abilene as one of their own, conducting business, participating in community affairs, and all the while secretly engaged in activities that defied comprehension. The blue glass bottles behind his bar became legendary, sought after by men who considered themselves connoisseurs of fine spirits, unaware of what they were really consuming. Dr. Joseph Eckhart, who first identified the true nature of the substance in the hidden jar, wrote in his personal journal in February 1892, "I find myself unable to forget the expression on Marshall Wilkins's face when I told him what the liquid contained. It was not merely shock or disgust, but something deeper, as though a fundamental assumption about the world had been shattered. I understand this feeling all too well. Before this case, I believed I had seen the worst that human beings could do to one another. I was wrong. There are depths to human depravity that most of us, mercifully, never have to contemplate. Eckhart's medical practice in Abilene never fully recovered from his association with the case. Though he had been instrumental in uncovering the truth, many residents found themselves unable to separate the messenger from the horrific message he had delivered. By 1894, he had relocated to Dallas, where he eventually established a successful practice, though colleagues noted that he never again discussed the Thorne case and appeared to avoid any professional situations involving forensic examination. Marshal Thomas Wilkins remained in his position until 1901, widely credited with reforming local law enforcement in the wake of the scandal. His meticulous approach to the investigation served as a model for subsequent cases throughout the region, and he was frequently consulted by other jurisdictions facing unusual crimes. Upon his retirement, he declined numerous offers to write about his experiences, stating in his only public comment on the matter that some evils are best not given voice through excessive contemplation. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the case, and the one that continues to disturb those who study it, is the question of the patrons. According to the evidence gathered in the investigation, dozens of men knowingly consumed Thorne's special reserve over the years, many becoming regular customers willing to pay extraordinary sums for the privilege. While the initial deception is understandable, they believed they were drinking a uniquely crafted whiskey. Questions remain about those who attended the private tastings in the back room during the final years of the drover's rest. Did they know, or at least suspect, the true nature of what they were consuming? The journal entries suggest that Thorne became increasingly bold in his hints and allusions during these events, using terms like essence and life force, that, while not explicit, certainly pointed toward something beyond ordinary distilling. And if they did suspect, what does this reveal about human nature? The possibility that men of standing in the community might knowingly participate in such consumption, drawn by curiosity, the allure of the forbidden, or the reported effects, opens disturbing questions about the potential for darkness that may lie dormant in seemingly ordinary individuals. Several psychological studies conducted in the latter half of the 20th century have used the Thorne case as a starting point for examining how otherwise conventional people can be gradually led to participate in transgressive behaviors. These studies suggest that the ritualistic aspects of the tastings, the exclusivity of the gatherings, and the incremental nature of the revelations created an environment where normal moral boundaries could be suspended. As one researcher noted in a 1978 paper, the participants were not suddenly confronted with the full horror, but rather introduced to it so gradually that each step seemed only a small deviation from the previous one. In 1968, during renovations of the Taylor County Courthouse, workers discovered a small metal box sealed inside a wall cavity. The box, which appeared to have been placed there sometime in the 1890s, contained several items related to the Thorne case that had not been included in the official record. A blue glass bottle, empty but still carrying a faint odor. A page torn from Thorne's journal that had apparently been removed before the document was entered into evidence, and a daguerreotype photograph showing a man believed to be Thorne standing beside another individual whose face had been deliberately scratched out of the image. County officials quietly transferred these items to the state archives without public announcement, concerned about renewed interest in a case many felt should remain buried in the past. The items were cataloged and stored, accessible only to researchers with specific authorization. Few have seen them in the decades since, and fewer still have connected them to the broader narrative of the case. The scratched-out face in the photograph raises particularly intriguing questions. Was this Dr. Reed, or perhaps the mysterious professor mentioned by Lucinda Moore? Or was it someone else entirely, another accomplice whose involvement was never discovered? The deliberate defacement suggests someone wanted this individual's identity concealed, even in materials hidden away where few would ever see them. The torn journal page contained passages more disturbing than those in the main document, describing what Thorne called the ultimate experience, suggesting that he himself had consumed his own creation mixed with conventional whiskey while engaging in the act of killing. These passages had apparently been deemed too shocking for inclusion in the public record, removed by someone involved in the original investigation, who nevertheless felt they should be preserved for historical purposes, rather than destroyed entirely. As with many historical mysteries, complete answers remain elusive. The story of Malcolm Thorne and the Drover's Rest exists now primarily as a footnote in larger narratives about frontier justice, unusual crimes, and the development of forensic techniques. Yet for those who encounter it, the case retains its power to disturb and unsettle, to prompt reflection on what may lie beneath the surface of ordinary life. Contemporary scholars examining the case often focus on its broader implications rather than its sensational details. Sociologists have used it to illustrate how communities can develop blind spots regarding certain members, particularly those who maintain a veneer of respectability while conforming to expected social norms. Psychologists point to Thorne as an early documented example of what would now be classified as a psychopathic personality, demonstrating the ability to mimic normal human interaction while lacking fundamental moral constraints. For historians of the American West, the case provides a counterpoint to romanticized narratives of frontier life. It reminds us that alongside the familiar stories of cowboys, cattle drives, and the gradual establishment of civilization in previously wild territories, there existed darker currents, individuals who exploited the limited oversight and high mobility of frontier society to pursue their own disturbed ends. The town of Abilene itself has an ambivalent relationship with this aspect of its history, while embracing other elements of its past, particularly its role in the cattle industry and as home to President Dwight D. Eisenhower's boyhood home. Official histories and tourist materials make no mention of Thorne or the Drover's Rest. When the case is referenced at all in local contexts, it is usually with minimal detail and an emphasis on how the community came together to address the threat once it was discovered. This selective remembrance reflects a broader pattern in how communities engage with the most disturbing aspects of their histories. The desire to focus on positive achievements and overcome difficult chapters is understandable, yet complete erasure risks losing important lessons about vigilance, the dangers of assuming the best about those who present well socially, and the need for robust systems of accountability even in small, seemingly close-knit societies. In the end, perhaps the most fitting epitaph for this dark chapter in Abilene's history comes from the final paragraph of Thorne's unsent letter discovered by Professor Garrison in 1952. "I do not expect understanding or forgiveness. I seek only acknowledgement that what I discovered was real, that beneath the veneer of civilization, beneath all our pretensions to refinement and progress, there exists an ancient hunger that most dare not name. I gave it a name, I gave it a taste, and in doing so I revealed something not just about myself, but about all men who find themselves drawn to the darkness, whether they admit it or not. Remember this, if you remember nothing else. The line between the monster and the man is thinner than most would care to believe." These words, written by a man responsible for unimaginable horrors, contain a disturbing kernel of truth that continues to resonate more than a century later. The case of Malcolm Thorne and the Drover's Rest stands as a reminder that evil rarely announces itself openly, that the most dangerous predators are often those who understand how to navigate social expectations while concealing their true nature, and that the capacity for darkness exists alongside our more noble qualities as human beings. As we contemplate this history from the relative safety of the present day, the question that perhaps matters most is not what drove one disturbed individual to commit such acts, but how a community failed to recognize what was happening in its midst for so long. The answer lies partly in the natural human tendency to seek innocent explanations for troubling observations, partly in the reluctance to accuse a seemingly respectable member of society without absolute proof, and partly in the difficulty of imagining horrors that lie so far outside normal experience. In this sense, the legacy of the Thorn case extends beyond its specific historical context to touch on issues that remain relevant today: how we balance trust with vigilance in our communities, how we respond to behaviors that seem merely eccentric rather than dangerous, and how we come to terms with the reality that some threats come not from obvious outsiders but from those who have successfully integrated themselves into the fabric of everyday life. The blue bottles that once sat behind the bar at the Drover's Rest have long since been destroyed or hidden away in private collections. The building itself is gone, replaced by structures that give no hint of what once occurred there. Even the memories of those who lived through the events have faded with the passing of generations. Yet the story endures, a dark thread in the complex tapestry of American history, reminding us that alongside the familiar narratives of progress and achievement run currents of human experience that most would prefer not to acknowledge, but that we ignore at our peril.